trucks moving for the suburbs. Go hit him. Looks like we have an opportunity to crack some deposit boxes.
I would like to treat you to a little trip to Los Angeles. Maybe do a little job for me there, huh? Yes?
Hey, do you want to go in your cage? Cut it out.
A pilot of mine has gone down in the woods. Find him and get him back here.
Time to hit the first row back, gang. Halloween treat, guys. Headed back to the cabin in the woods.
Huh? I don't even want to try to understand it.
Hello everyone, I'm coming directly to you for asking a quick favor. Will you add your name today to join our team? I've said from the outset of this election that we're in a battle for the soul of this nation. Who we are, what we believe, who we want to be, it's all at stake. And that's truer today than ever. But the only way to defeat Donald Trump and move forward is by doing it together. So please, join us. You're not just wanted, you're needed.
Was transporting some snow for me. Colombia.
We all should be subject to the same justice. If it doesn't work that way, that's over. We're done.
Your Honor, I just wanted to explain these movements that you see. My goodness, hate comes in many forms.
Kentucky restaurant owner known for giving out free meals to law enforcement was killed after officers and the Kentucky National Guard returned fire, allegedly, on a group of people gathered outside of his restaurant early Monday. So the restaurant owner is David McCaddy, and he is, he was beloved in the community. He owned Yaya's Barbecue in Louisville, and he was super friendly with the cops, never had any problems with them. And so the protests start, and apparently there was a group of protesters gathered in front of Dino's Food Mart, which is right next to the barbecue restaurant. And the police opened fire, and unfortunately, first of all, they shouldn't open fire at all, regardless of who the victim ends up being. But in this case, it was David McCaddy, and he lost his life. Now, here's what we know about the cop who opened fire. It's Officer Katie Cruz, and she has been put on administrative reassignment after her involvement in the shooting. Here's a picture of her. Apparently, before she was involved in this fatal shooting, she was mocking a demonstrator on Facebook using a picture from the Courier-Journal. So here's the image. You see a protester, holding flowers up to this cop. And again, she used this image to mock the protester. And here's what she wrote. I hope the pepper balls that got lit up with a little later on first come back and get you some more, old girl. I'll be on the line again tonight. That was her reaction to a peaceful protester who tried to hand her flowers during the protests. She should be fired, and she should also be prosecuted for just indiscriminately opening fire on a crowd of people. But I should also note that there were other consequences, including the police chief, Steve Conrad, getting fired.
He got fired because they had not turned his cameras. My guess is if you got fired for that, it was probably a regular practice. And that's why the police chief would get fired. So let's talk about the different offenses. First of all, the protester that he was yelling at on Facebook. This place is about to get hot. I hope you got hurt by the pepper ball that you got hit. That's a hell of a thing. Then taunting her to come back out so she can get assaulted again by the cops is another hell of a thing. And she says, she looked like she's giving me flowers, but she also said something. Why? Who cares? Who cares if she says something? Disrespecting a police officer, biggest crime in America. So, I can't wait to assault you again. Now, that's terrible, but relatively minor compared to what happened the next night. So with McCaddy, he's basically an entrepreneur. He does this barbecue stand. That literally sets the table for the community. Hundreds of people show up the next night to mourn him. And in the beginning, the night that he got killed, there was no protest. There was a curfew that they shooting were violently curfew. And that was to get his barbecue. They were around his barbecue stand. And so there were no protests at all. So the cops went there, looking for trouble, and they weren't allowed to, and they thought maybe it's a gun. They then fired a dozen shots. 9 seconds. Wait a minute, it was a gunshot. You were worried about open the fucking door. Protecting yourself, and you were positive it was a gunshot. You would have fired immediately. You took 9 seconds to think it through, and there was no further allowed going. Then you decided to open fire indiscriminately into a crowd. Historically, had given the cops straight through the whole time. His dream was to take the stand and in that same lot build a restaurant. And he was actually on his way there. That's why there were so many people around his stand, even during curfew, because he was celebrating that shooting, including earlier by the time he was in the state. Look, firing into a crowd indiscriminately. Everybody stay down. Can be charged with murder. You would be charged with murder. Why the hell are you firing into a crowd? Well, I thought maybe, there's a loud noise and I heard it was a gunshot, and 9 seconds ago. You'd be convicted so quick. And if it's a cop, you say, wow, they weren't. They should be convicted more. They should be convicted easier. Not harder. Why? It's the cop's job to be responsible. He gave you a badge and a gun. That comes with tremendous responsibility. You should show more restraint. It's supposed to be a risky, dangerous one, and we appreciate that you're taking that risk. If it's not a risky job, then you find it permanently on the off chance that you might be in danger or was in danger some time ago. Well, then it's not a hard job at all. And you violated that trust and responsibility that we gave you. It should be the highest priority of prosecutors to put those cops away. Instead, of course, as we all know, it's the lowest priority. In fact, oftentimes, as in Ferguson, the cops act as the defense attorney rather than the local prosecutors act as the defense attorney rather than as the prosecutor. And so that's what happened in the Mike Brown case. And so it's, will there be justice there for this guy who's loving the community? Will his history as any judge? No. And later he'll be hired by another department a couple of years later after things calm down. Why? Because it's the only job in America that if you do it poorly, other police departments, other people in that profession can't wait to hire them.
Thanks for watching the Uncooked. Really appreciate it. Another way to show support is through YouTube memberships. You'll get to interact with us more. There's live chat emojis, badges. You've got emojis of me, Anna, John, JR. So those are super fun. But you also get playback of our exclusive member-only shows and specials right after they air. So all that, all you gotta do is click that join button right underneath the video. Thank you.
In the weeks since protests began following the murder of George Floyd, the movement has been more successful than many people could have imagined. 53% of American voters now say that they support Black Lives Matter, when only 2 years ago it was around 40%. Multiple major corporations in America have now said that they are actively going to diversify their workplace and hire black people who they previously discriminated against for so long. And millions of white Americans are now desperately trying to find a second black friend. But one of the biggest shifts in America is something the country has been resisting for 155 years.
Over at the Capitol, House Speaker Nancy Pelosi is calling for nearly a dozen Confederate statues to be removed from that building, saying they pay homage to hate.
At a rally in Richmond, a statue of Confederate President Jefferson Davis was pulled down last night. The face smashed in before it was towed away in pieces. NASCAR's Bubba Wallace racing last night with the hashtag Black Lives Matter painted on his car. The race starting hours after NASCAR banned the Confederate flag.
That was a huge pivotal moment for the sport. A lot of backlash, but it creates borders and allows the community to come together as one.
Yeah, from Congress all the way to NASCAR, all over the country, people are offering questions. Is it finally time to let go of the Confederacy? And I think it's really impressive that NASCAR is doing it, because the Confederate flag is extremely popular with a lot of their fans. In fact, just to soften the blow, here's maybe what they should do. Ban the fans from bringing the flag to the races, but then incorporate it into the race itself. You know? So like if you win the race, they wave the second flag, and then for the loser, they wave the Confederate flag. Yeah, that way everybody wins. The one thing that does confuse me though is, why did Congress have Confederate statues in the first place? I mean, the Confederacy fought against America, so why would you have statues of them in America's Congress building? It makes no sense. It's like white ladies having statues of Bluetooth in their pictures. And I'll show you a funny picture of what that would look like, but I still have no idea what Bluetooth actually is. I'm completely insane how it feels like the government treats actual traitors better than black citizens. George Floyd maybe had a $20 bill in his counterfeit. He gets choked to death. president of the Confederacy was responsible for 500,000 dead Americans, and the response was, well, let's act the quarry for the finest piece of marble. We gotta remember this guy. So more than 150 years after the Civil War, the winning side is finally deciding its devastating to keep celebrating the side that fights Victoria. And one step that the Pentagon is considering is renaming military bases that are named after Confederate officers. You know, names like Fort Bragg in North Carolina, Fort Hood in Texas, and Fort Slave Catcher in Georgia. I don't even know how they let that one pass. But what's interesting is that while the military thinks that this symbolic move can help raise relations in the ranks, the commander in chief strongly disagrees.
U.S. military leaders have expressed a willingness to discuss renaming bases named after Confederate generals. But tonight, President Trump says that won't happen, saying they are part of a great American heritage.
The tweet from the president, he writes, the United States of America trained and deployed our heroes on these hallowed grounds and won 2 world wars. Therefore, my administration will not even consider the renaming of magnificent and fabled military installations.
You know, part of me thinks Trump is doing this because he's trying to appeal to his Confederate loving base. The other part of me thinks he's doing it because he thinks Fort Bragg is named after him. Never been humble, no powerful, I'm the guy. They should have Bragg, but as usual, like, Trump's logic makes no sense. Because America didn't win World War II because of the names of those bases. Right? America won World War II because Tom Hanks found that thing. That was the turning point. And you can call the base whatever you want. It's not going to determine how effectively a soldier is going to fight. America isn't going to be losing to Russia in World War III like, we should have never renamed those bases! That was our secret weapon! Oh! I know for some people it's controversial, but you gotta understand. The reason the military generals are open to the names of these bases is the same reason that NASCAR is doing. They want the military to take a unified stand against racism, and they want to show that the American military stands for all Americans, including the millions of minorities who have served within its ranks. Because take a second, and imagine being a black soldier, training at a base that is named after somebody who didn't even think of you as a human being. That isn't just offensive to those soldiers, it's offensive to the Confederate generals too. Because I mean, imagine if they came back and saw what was happening at a base that is named after them. My God, all of the slaves have gone. You know, with all these protests sweeping across America, people have been comparing this moment to the civil rights movement of the 1960s. And much like the 1960s, law enforcement officers have met these calls to end police brutality with even more police brutality.
Across the country, peaceful protests have too often devolved into standoffs with heavily armed police using military-style tactics. Flashbangs, tear gas, rubber bullets, helicopters, armored vehicles.
Law enforcement in riot gear approach a barrier. Protesters on the other side, hands up in the air, chanting, "Don't shoot." But that's exactly what they did, shooting tear gas and rubber bullets.
The threat of terrorism after 9/11 convinced those departments are facing off against their own citizens.
Just take a moment to think about that. The police department got this heavy-duty equipment to fight terrorists. That's why they got their equipment, post 9/11. And now they're using it against Americans who are exercising their right to vote. And I'm sorry, what about these people screaming terrorist speech? Like, maybe I've forgotten my history, but I don't remember the part where Al-Qaeda attacked America with cardboard signs. And an argument I've heard some people make is that the only reason the police are doing this is because the protesters are looting or being violent. That's what they say. No, they're doing this because the people are violent. But as happens so often, the police's story never matches the actual footage. Because for the past week, the internet has been full of videos of police officers attacking protesters with no provocation whatsoever.
Caught on camera from coast to coast, alleged excessive force by police officers. Attacks against protesters who were demonstrating against police brutality
In New York, police drove a vehicle into a crowd of people protesting there. In Los Angeles, police bring gassing to people who witnesses say were simply standing with their hands up. A New York police officer caught on camera pushing a woman who was demonstrating. An officer pulling a man's face mask off and spraying him with pepper spray. This unsettling image of an officer kicking a woman who was mixed.
Caught on camera, a protester run over by an HPD-mounted patrol unit at the height of the protests.
We as black people deal with this every day. Black and brown people are treated brutally every day.
I don't care who you are. Those images have to be upset. Because these images are the antithesis of what America is supposed to stand for. And this is supposed to be the country where you have the freedom to say whatever you want. A democracy, right? You can say whatever you want, whether it's Black Lives Matter or let all dreams bleach. The government is not supposed to physically punish you for that. And that hasn't always been the case in America. But that is the when people were protesting in Michigan, saying that they want to go out, they want to go back to work, they want to get haircuts, they don't care about the coronavirus, they weren't getting beaten up. And that's what America is, the freedom to protest. And the freedom to protest isn't the only American ideal that the police have been trying to suppress. It seems like they've been really making a concerted effort to go after the free press.
More than 300 journalists have faced press freedom violations.
Across the United States, the camera is rolling when law enforcement seem to be targeting the journalists.
I am pressed.
We identified ourselves as press, and they fired tear gas canisters on us at point-blank range.
This Australian cameraman and reporter were shocked and hit while live on air.
another Monday of another police brutality incident, like another story that has people going, how long, how much, when is it enough? The story is out of Atlanta. Rayshard Brooks. And forgive me if I get any of the details wrong, but as far as I know, you've probably seen the video, you've read the story. Rayshard was in his car in a Wendy's drive-thru. He was drunk or tipsy, or he had alcohol and he fell asleep. Fell asleep, people are driving around his car. And so somebody at the Wendy's called the cops. The cops arrive at Wendy's and, they get Rayshard out of the car. And they start talking to him for about 30 minutes. You know, asking him, is he drunk? Why is he driving? What's going on? I mean, it seems pretty standard. And the whole time throughout this video, you have human beings being human beings. You have Rashad, who's clearly inebriated, and he's talking to the cops. And you have the cops asking him the questions. And what was interesting for me about this video is, like in the beginning, it seems like everything is going to be fine. The cops are talking to him like a person. They're not being aggro. They're not being disrespectful. They're not being mean or anything. He's being respectful. He's calling them sir. He's not cutting them out. He's offering to work. Everything is going well. Everything is going well. And then, in one moment, in just a few seconds, every part of that normal story turns into the abnormal ending that we've come to know as interaction with police and black people. Because the police try and arrest him, he resists and he wrestles with the police. In the scuffle, they try and tase him. While he's being tased, he grabs the taser, he gets up, he runs away. And I'm missing a few beats of the story because I don't want to take you through too much of it, but that's essentially what happened. Rashad runs away, and the police chase him. As he's running, he shoots off the taser, and one of the cops switches his weapon from a taser to a gun and shoots Rashad 2 or 3 times in the back, and he's dead. And immediately everyone goes, everyone goes to their battle station. That's what plays me about this story. Everyone just goes to their battle station. Immediately people go, well, once again, another example of black people resisting the cops and being criminals, and why are you driving drunk, and why are you running away from the police, and what? And then, of course, you have other people, in their battle stations saying, oh, of course, another story of cops who immediately shoot a black man for just sleeping in his car. But, it's messy. No one wants to admit that the thing is messy. It's messy. If this story didn't happen now, maybe we would be looking at it differently. But it's a messy story. It's not the perfect story. And in a weird way, it not being the perfect story means we should look at it in the most perfect way possible. We should try and break it down and understand how something like this comes to be, because we don't always have video like this. We don't always have stories like this. And we don't even always look at it like this. But let's just take a moment to talk about what happened. You have a man who is sleeping in his car. Right? A man is sleeping in his car and he's drunk. Was he drunk driving? Let's say he is. Right? So he's broken some law, or no, not worth dying. So he's no jail. The police approach him, and even then I asked the question, why are armed police dealing with a man who's sleeping in his car? He posed no threat to anybody. No one in Wendy's felt afraid. Cars were driving around him. He's not stopping people from ordering food. So why are armed police there in the first place? That's the question I think, these are all the questions we ask. Why are armed police the first people who have to go and respond to somebody who's sleeping in their car who is drunk? Secondly, why do the police not just, the man says to them, I will walk home. If you're protecting and serving people, what is the true purpose of you not wanting people to drive drunk? It's that you don't want them killing themselves and other people. In this instance, no one has died because of his driving, and he hadn't killed himself because of his driving. And so as a police officer, maybe it's because I live in a utopian world where the police are truly just trying to protect themselves, not trying to write enough tickets, not trying to get enough people arrested, not trying to pull posters, no, they're trying to protect themselves. In that instance, you would hope a policeman would say, sir, you do not look fit to drive. You said your sister lives around the corner. You said you live, we'll take you home. We didn't find you driving drunk. We found you asleep in a car. So we'll give you the benefit of the doubt. The country's burning down because of the way black people are dealt with by the police. So let us show you just in a moment that it doesn't always have to end the way you think it has to end. I'm not saying they had to do that, but it would have been nice. They arrest him. He fights. Now, you know what's messy about the whole thing is you forget you are dealing with a drunk person. You're dealing with someone. The very fact that you're not allowed to sign a contract when you're drunk, the very fact that you're not allowed to do anything when you're drunk, tells us something about drunk. We know what a drunk person is in society. they're not going to do the logical thing. So as a policeman, if a drunk person does an illogical thing, like, I feel like you should acknowledge the fact that they're drunk. It doesn't mean they deserve to die. They're drunk. We know what drunk people do. I've been drunk. You've been drunk. Everyone has been drunk. You don't deserve to die for being drunk. And if police cannot respond or cannot handle a drunk person, well, then they shouldn't be responding. If you responding to a person who's drunk means that person can be dead, the whole point of you going there was to make sure that people don't die because of whatever happened. But if the people are going to end up dead anyway, then what's the point? And people say he shouldn't have resisted. Yes, he's drunk. I'm not excusing that, but he's drunk. In a situation like that, the sober person, in my opinion, the sober person, the onus is upon them to make sure the situation doesn't get out of hand. We're sober. He's drunk. How are two sober men wrestling with a drunk person on the ground? How does it get that far? How does it end with him losing his life? And people always say the same thing. They go, well, you know, if you didn't do that, then you would still be alive. They say this shit all the time. If you didn't do that, but the truth is, the if or if you didn't resist arrest, if you didn't resist arrest, you would still be alive. Or if you didn't run away from the cops, you would still be alive. Or if you didn't have a toy gun and were 12 years old in the middle of a park, then you would have still been alive. Well, you know what, if you weren't wearing a hoodie, you would have still been alive. Well, you know, if you didn't talk back to the cops, you would have still been alive. If you weren't sleeping in your bed as a black woman, you would have still been alive. There's one common thread beyond all the others. If you weren't black, maybe you'd still be alive. Well, that's our show for tonight, but before we go, The Daily Show and Comedy Central have been donations to 3 groups who are fighting against police brutality and systemic racism. The NAACP Legal Defense Fund, the Equal Justice Initiative, and the Bail Project. Now, if you'd like to help, and you have anything to give, then all you need to do is go to the following link and donate whatever you can. Until tomorrow, though, stay safe out there. Remember to wear your mask.
With the hospital system under increasing stress.
Makeshift hospital.
Wings of hospitals can be converted to a quarantine setup.
When you think of buildings, you always think of commercial buildings, but hospitals are buildings and schools are buildings. What happens inside the building is more important than the building itself. As we move forward into this new world, it's really about a building needing to be dynamic. A hospital example, the ability to use rooms in that hospital for multiple outcomes. So making an operating room one day, a pandemic room one day, a burn unit the next day. We have to be able to do that dynamically on the fly based on how our customers want to use their buildings.
While Trump is having a temper tantrum about the Supreme Court, his real king has been reserved for former National Security Advisor and full-time Got Milk ad, John Bolton. Because as you probably heard by now, Bolton is about to release a tell-all book, spilling all the tea from his time in the White House. And even though the book hasn't come out yet, it's already a riveting read.
Bolton confirms President Trump explicitly linked military aid to Ukraine to investigations of former Vice President Joe Biden, the central claim that led to the president being impeached. Bolton alleges President Trump expressed a willingness to halt criminal investigations, to in effect give personal favors to dictators he liked, citing cases involving China and Turkey.
At one point telling the Turkish president he had replaced Southern District of New York prosecutor to make an investigation into a Turkish firm go away.
Foremost on Trump's mind at all times was re-election. One example, says Bolton, the president asking China's President Xi to buy soybeans and wheat to help win the support of farmers. Quote, pleading with Xi to ensure he'd win.
Man, that is wild. According to Bolton, Trump's shady dealings with other countries went far beyond Ukraine. He was promising to personally kill any investigations into Turkish companies, and he was begging China to help him win re-election. And you know, that's not just corrupt. it's also really embarrassing. Because Bolton's book makes Trump sound less like a president and more like a crackhead who's out of cash. Come on, G. Just help me get one more term. Just give me one more term, and I'll suck your... Did I tell you about my electoral college? Now remember, John Bolton is not some lefty hero of the resistance. No, he's a Republican through and through. He worked with George W. Bush and his father and Ronald Reagan. He also ran a major GOP super PAC, and he was a paid commentator on Fox News. So he's as Republican as an assault rifle giving a lecture on trickle-down economics. So Bolton revealing these things about Trump should at least spark some concern. Because not only does he accuse Trump of abusing the presidency to keep himself in power, but it turns out Trump might be even more ignorant than we thought.
Bolton paints a picture of a highly uninformed and impulsive president. In excerpts of his book, The Room Where It Happened, Bolton says President Trump did not know Britain was a nuclear power and asked if Finland was part of Russia.
Point law. How do you become the president of the United States without knowing if Finland is its own country? I mean, I don't expect much from Trump, but if he doesn't even know about the white countries, then what charge does Papua New Guinea have? So, it's not a surprise that there's a lot of stuff that Trump doesn't know. But don't let that fool you into thinking that he doesn't know what he's doing. Because in the book, Bolton also reveals how one shocking moment from Trump's presidency was actually a carefully thought out plan.
In November 2018, Trump came under fire for writing an unfettered defense of the Saudi crown prince, littered with exclamation points over the killing of the Post columnist Jamal Khashoggi. But according to Bolton's book, the main goal of the missive was to take away attention from a story about Ivanka Trump using her personal email for government business. And here's the quote. "This will divert from Ivanka," Trump said, according to the book. "If I read the statement in person, that will take over the Ivanka thing."
That's right. Bolton says that Trump chose to personally defend Saudi Arabia's dictator over the murder of a journalist just to take attention away from Ivanka using a private email account for government business. And I'm sorry, but that's like lighting yourself on fire to distract from the fact that you fought. I mean, I get why Trump wanted to distract from Ivanka using a private email, aka Hillary Clinton. But if you just want to distract the media, there are way less horrifying ways to do it. You know, like maybe streak across the White House lawn, or eat a vegetable for the first time. Breaking news, the president has ingested a piece of broccoli. We'll bring you around-the-clock coverage as we wait to see how his body reacts. And I don't know about you, but I'll never be able to trust another Trump scandal again. Like, does he actually think Mexicans are racist? Or was he just trying to distract from the mustard on his shirt? So I don't know. Selling out your credibility and abandoning America's ideals just to get your daughter out of a jam, that seems pretty awful to me. But, on the other hand, I don't remember shit about Ivanka's email scandal. So hey, I guess it works. So, just from the excerpts that we've seen, John Bolton's book has painted Trump as corrupt, dumb, and amoral. But my favorite thing that has come out of the book so far also shows us that Trump is like very real.
As the Washington Post reported today, quote, "In the months following the summit, Bolton described Trump's inordinate interest in Secretary of State Mike Pompeo delivering a Trump autographed copy of Elton John's hymn during Pompeo's follow-on visit to North Korea. Trump had used the term Little Rocket Man to criticize the North Korean leader, but subsequently tried to convince Kim that it was a term of affection. Getting this CD to Kim remained a high priority for several months."
Yep, you heard that right. The President of the United States, obsessed with getting a CD to Kim Jong-un, like some teenager giving a mixtape to his crush. "You gotta listen to track 5. It reminds me of the time when you said you were gonna leave your nuclear weapons and you didn't. So tricky." You know, this might actually explain why nuclear negotiations between America and North Korea broke down. Because can you imagine being Kim Jong-un and then getting a signed CD from Elton John, but it's signed by Donald Trump? I mean, that's like getting an autographed Michael Jordan jersey.
but it's signed by Donald Trump. There's no way to make it more of a joke. This is the joke. Weird joke. It's also weird that Trump thinks Kim Jong-un listens to CDs. Dude, he's the president of North Korea. The man listens to cassettes. So these are just some of the crazy details that have come out of this book. And it turns out there are many other things as well, like Trump encouraging China to put their Muslim population in a detainment camp, or saying that journalists deserve to be executed, or even that invading Venezuela would be, quote, cool. Yeah, it doesn't end. Now, Trump's response to all of these revelations has been pretty predictable. He claims that Bolton is lying, and that he's just a disgruntled, boring fool. Which is basically what he says about any former employees who criticized him. He's also suing Bolton to try and prevent the book from being released. Because clearly Trump is afraid that this book is going to tarnish his reputation. But Mr. President, don't worry about that at all. Because whatever is in this book, I promise you, will in no way change our opinion of you. Well, that's our show for tonight. But before we go, the Daily Show and Comedy Central have been donating to 3 groups who are fighting against police brutality and systemic racism: the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, the Equal Justice Initiative, and the Bail Project. Now, if you would like to help out and you have the means, then please go to the following link and donate whatever you can.
So many firsts are happening as we speak. First time school is home, and home is school. First time working out in your living room gym. First time having happy hour online. First time having to file your taxes from home. But you don't have to do it alone. TurboTax Live has CPAs on demand to answer questions, help get your best possible refund, and make filing your taxes easy from home. Intuit TurboTax Live.
Merchandise. Merry Christmas.
This is Lumen, the first device for hacking your metabolism. With just one breath, Lumen tells you what you're currently burning for energy, carbs, or body fat, so you can see what's going on with your metabolism in real time and what to do about it. Breathe in the morning to get a personalized nutrition plan for the day. One that's based on your personal goals and adaptable to your eating habits. Breathe before a meal to see how the last one affected you and get recommendations to keep your body on track. Breathe to see if you have enough energy for your workout or if you should fuel up.
I gotta lay down. I gotta take my black ass to bed. I gotta go to work tomorrow.
In various cities around the world, people trapped in their homes have been leaning out of their windows every single night to applaud healthcare workers for fighting nonstop to keep people alive. But in London, one man trying to raise funds to fight coronavirus has decided to take things to the next.
That part.
No match.
Hey, game in the game for the fame. Everybody just know my name. Steady hands, always on the track, never going back. Always spitting facts, you know. Got the map.
Yo, hold up. This is what it would look like if a virus.
Hey, game in the game for the fame. Everybody just know my name. Steady hands, always on the track, never going back. Got the map.
Who are you?
Did he say? Did he say?
I really don't know who you are.
Did he say everybody jizzed on my name?
Everybody just know my name.
Yo, listen, white women will bounce to anything. You could have nails on a chalkboard, and these brothers will be like, "Ooh, look at my rhythm." Hey, I want you guys to comment and let us know exactly at which point you guys checked out due to cringe. I want to see a timestamp with exactly when you guys are like, "Can't do it." Abort mission.
So you guys use dating apps? How would you guys describe your...
We might have a very valuable object in this bank. I have insurance papers backing that up.
Oh my lord. So reads me.
It had the wrong shape on the pillow. I forced myself to stare at it, to study it, simply because I could hardly endure the pain and the smell of decay, and I was tempted over and over to try to open his eyes. All these were mad thoughts, mad impulses. The main thought was this. I had laughed at him. I had not believed him. I had not been kind to him. He had fallen because of me. This really happened, didn't it? The boy whispered. You're telling me something that's true. Yes, said the vampire, looking at him without surprise. I want to go on telling you. But as his eyes passed over the boy and returned to the window, he showed only faint interest in the boy, who seemed engaged in some silent inner struggle. But you said you didn't know about the visions, that you, a vampire, didn't know for certain whether I want to take things in order, said the vampire. I want to go on telling you things as they happen. No, I don't know about the visions. To this day. And again he waited until the boy said, Yes, please, go on. Well, I wanted to sell the plantations. I never wanted to see the house or the oratory again. I leased them, finally, to an agency which would work them for me and manage things so I need never go there, and I moved my mother and sister to one of the townhouses in New Orleans. Of course, I did not escape my brother for a moment. I could think of nothing but his body rotting in the ground. He was buried in the St. Louis Cemetery in New Orleans, and I did everything to avoid passing those gates. But still I thought of him constantly. Drunk or sober, I saw his body rotting in the coffin, and I couldn't bear it. Over and over I dreamed that he was at the head of the steps, and I was holding his arm, talking kindly to him, urging him back into the bedroom, telling him gently that I did believe him, that he must pray for me to have faith. Meantime, the slaves on Pointe du Lac, that was my plantation, had begun to talk of seeing his ghost on the gallery. The overseer couldn't keep order. People in society asked my sister offensive questions about the whole incident, and she became an hysteric. She wasn't really an hysteric. She simply thought she ought to react that way, so she did. I drank all the time and was at home as little as possible. I lived like a man who wanted to die, but who had no courage to do it himself. I walked black streets and alleys alone. I passed out in cabarets. I backed out of 2 duels more from apathy than cowardice, and truly wished to be murdered. And then I was attacked. It might have been anyone. And my invitation was open to sailors, thieves, maniacs, anyone. But it was a vampire. He caught me just a few steps from my door one night and left me for dead. Or so I thought. You mean he sucked your blood? The boy asked. Yes, the vampire laughed. He sucked my blood. That is the way it's done. But you lived, said the young man. You said he left you for dead. Well, he drained me almost to the point of death, which was for him sufficient. I was put to bed as soon as I was found, confused and really unaware of what had happened to me. I suppose I thought that drink had finally caused a stroke. I expected to die now and had no interest in eating or drinking or talking to the doctor. My mother sent for the priest. I was feverish by then, and I told the priest everything. All about my brother's visions and what I had done. I remember I clung to his arm, making him swear over and over he would tell no one. I know I didn't kill him, I said to the priest finally. It's that I cannot live now that he's dead, not after the way I treated him. That's ridiculous, he answered me. Of course you can live. There's nothing wrong with you but self-indulgence. Your mother needs you, not to mention your sister. And as for this brother of yours, he was possessed of the devil. I was so stunned when he said this, I couldn't protest. The devil made the visions, he went on to explain. The devil was rampant. The entire country of France was under the influence of the devil, and the revolution had been his greatest triumph. Nothing would have saved my brother but exorcism, prayer, and fasting, men to hold him down while the devil raged in his body and tried to throw him about. The devil threw him down the steps. It's perfectly obvious, he declared. You weren't talking to your brother in that room. You were talking to the devil. Well, this enraged me. I believed before that I had been pushed to my limits, but I had not. He went on talking about the devil, about voodoo amongst the slaves, and cases of possession in other parts of the world, and I went wild. I wrecked the room in the process of nearly killing him. But your strength, the vampire? Asked the boy. I was out of my mind, the vampire explained. I did things I could not have done in perfect health. The scene is confused, pale, fantastical now, but I do remember that I drove him out of the back doors of the house, across the courtyard and against the brick wall of the kitchen, where I pounded his head until I nearly killed him. When I was subdued, finally, and exhausted then, almost to the point of death, they bled me, the fools. But I was going to say something else. It was then that I conceived of my own egotism. Perhaps I'd seen it reflected in the priest. His contemptuous attitude towards my brother reflected my own. His immediate and shallow carping about the devil, his refusal to even entertain the idea that sanctity had passed so close. But he did believe in possession by the devil. That is a much more mundane idea, said the vampire immediately. People who cease to believe in God or goodness altogether still believe in the devil. I don't know why. No, I do indeed know why. Evil is always possible, and goodness is eternally difficult. But you must understand, possession is really another way of saying someone is mad. I felt it was for the priest. I'm sure he'd seen madness. Perhaps he had stood right over raving madness and pronounced it possession. You don't have to see Satan when he is exorcised, but to stand in the presence of a saint, to believe that the saint has seen a vision. No, it's egotism, our refusal to believe it could occur in our midst. I never thought of it that way, said the boy. But what happened to you? You said they bled you to cure you, and that must have nearly killed you. The vampire laughed. Yes, it certainly did. But the vampire came back that night. You see, he wanted Pointe du Lac, my plantation. It was very late, after my sister had fallen asleep. I can remember it as if it were yesterday. He came in from the courtyard, opening the French doors without a sound. A tall, fair-skinned man with a mass of blonde hair and a graceful, almost feline quality to his movements. And gently he draped a shawl over my sister's eyes and lowered the wick of the lamp. She dozed there beside the basin and the cloth with which she bathed my forehead, and she never once stirred under that shawl until morning. By that time I was greatly changed. What was this change? Asked the boy. The vampire sighed. He leaned back against the chair and looked at the walls. At first I thought he was another doctor, or someone summoned by the family to try to reason with me. But this suspicion was removed at once. He stepped close to my bed and leaned down so that his face was in the lamplight. And I saw that he was no ordinary man at all. His gray eyes burned with an incandescence, and the long white hands which hung by his sides were not those of a human being. I think I knew everything in that instant, and all that he told me was only aftermath. What I mean is, the moment I saw him, saw his extraordinary aura, and knew him to be no creature I'd ever known, I was reduced to nothing. That ego which could not accept the presence of an extraordinary human being in its midst was crushed. All my conceptions, even my guilt and wish to die, seemed utterly unimportant. I completely forgot myself, he said, now silently touching his breast with his fist. I forgot myself totally. And in the same instant, I knew totally the meaning of possibility. From then on, I experienced only increasing wonder. As he talked to me and told me of what I might become, of what his life had been and stood to be, my past shrank to embers. I saw my life as if I stood apart from it. The vanity, the self-serving, the constant fleeing from one petty annoyance after another, the lip service to God and the Virgin, and a host of saints whose names filled my prayer books, none of whom made the slightest difference in a narrow, materialistic and selfish existence. I saw my real gods, the gods of most men. Food, drink, and security in conformity. Cinders. The boy's face was tense with a mixture of confusion and amazement. And so you decided to become a vampire? He asked. The vampire was silent for a moment. Decided. It doesn't seem the right word. Yet I cannot say it was inevitable from the moment that he stepped into that room. No. Indeed, it was not inevitable. Yet I can't say I decided. Let me say that when he'd finished speaking, no other decision was possible for me. And I pursued my course without a backward glance. Except for one. Except for one? What? My last sunrise, said the vampire. That morning I was not yet a vampire, and I saw my last sunrise. I remember it completely. Yet I do not think I remember any other sunrise before it. I remember the light came first to the tops of the French windows, paling behind the lace curtains, and then a gleam growing brighter and brighter in patches among the leaves of the trees. Finally the sun came through the windows themselves, and the lace lay in shadows on the stone floor and all over the form of my sister, who was still sleeping, shadows of lace on the shawl over her shoulders and head. As soon as she was warm, she pushed the shawl away without awakening. And then the sun shone full on her eyes, and she tightened her eyelids. Then it was gleaming on the table where she rested her head on her arms, and gleaming, blazing in the water in the pitcher. And I could feel it on my hands, counterpane, and then on my face. I lay in the bed thinking about all the things the vampire had told me, and then it was I to the sunrise and went out to become a vampire. It was the last sunrise. The vampire was looking out the window again. And when he stopped, the silence was so sudden the boy seemed to hear it. Then he could hear the noises from the street. The sound of a truck was deafening. The light cord stirred with the vibration. Then the truck was gone. "Do you miss it?" he asked then in a small voice. "Not really. said the vampire. There are so many other things. But where were we? You want to know how it happened, how I became a vampire? Yes, said the boy. How did you change exactly? I can't tell you exactly, said the vampire. I can tell you about it and close it with words that will make the value of it to me evident to you. But I can't tell you exactly. Any more than I could tell you exactly what is the experience of sex if you have never had it. The young man seemed struck suddenly with still another question. But before he could speak, the vampire went on. As I told you, this vampire, Lestat, wanted the plantation. A mundane reason, surely, for granting me a life which will last until the end of the world. But he was not a very discriminating person. He didn't consider the world's small population of vampires as being a select club, I should say. He had human problems. A blind father who did not know his son was a vampire and must not find out. Living in New Orleans had become too difficult for him, considering his needs and the necessity to care for his father, and he wanted Pointe du Lac. We went at once to the plantation the next evening, ensconced the blind father in the master bedroom, and I proceeded to make the change. I cannot say that it consisted in any one step, really. Though one, of course, was the step beyond which I could make no return. But there were several acts involved, and the first was the death of the overseer. Lestat took him in his sleep. I was to watch and to approve. That is, to witness the taking of a human life as proof of my commitment and part of my change. This proved without doubt the most difficult part for me. I've told you I had no fear regarding my own death, only a squeamishness about taking my life myself. But I had a most high regard for the life of others, and a horror of death most recently developed because of my brother. I had to watch the overseer awake with a start, trying to throw off Lestat with both hands, fail, then lie there struggling under Lestat's grasp, and finally go limp, drained of blood, and die. He did not die at once. We stood in his narrow bedroom for the better part of an hour, watching him die. Part of my change, as I said. Lestat would never have stayed otherwise. Then it was necessary to get rid of the overseer's body. I was almost sick from this. Weak and feverish already, I had little reserve, and handling the dead body with such a purpose caused me nausea. Lestat was laughing, telling me callously that I would feel so different once I was a vampire that I would laugh too. He was wrong about that. I never laugh at death, no matter how often and regularly I am the cause of it. But let me take things in order. We had to drive up the river road until we came to open fields and leave the overseer there. We tore his coat, stole his money, and saw to it his lips were stained with liquor. I knew his wife, who lived in New Orleans, and knew the state of desperation she would suffer when the body was discovered. But more than sorrow for her, I felt pain that she would never know what had happened, that her husband had not been found drunk on the road by robbers. As we beat the body, bruising the face and the shoulders, I became more and more aroused. Of course, you must realize that all this time the vampire Lestat was extraordinary. He was no more human to me than a biblical angel. But under this pressure, my enchantment with him was strained. I had seen my becoming a vampire in two lights. The first light was simply enchantment. Lestat had overwhelmed me on my deathbed, but the other light was my wish for self-destruction, my desire to be thoroughly damned. This was the open door through which Lestat had come on both the first and second occasion. Now I was not destroying myself, but someone else. The overseer, his wife, his family. I recoiled and might have fled from Lestat, my sanity thoroughly shattered, had he not sensed, with an infallible instinct, what was happening. Infallible instinct, the vampire mused. Let me say the powerful instinct of a vampire to whom even the slightest change in a human's facial expression is as apparent as a gesture. Lestat had preternatural timing. He rushed me into the carriage and whipped the horses home. I want to die, I began to murmur. This is unbearable. I want to die. You have it in your power to kill me. Let me die. I refused to look at him, to be spellbound by the sheer beauty of his appearance. He spoke my name to me, softly, laughing. As I said, he was determined to have the plantation. But would he have let you go? Asked the boy. Under any circumstances? I don't know. Knowing Lestat as I do now, I would say he would have killed me rather than let me go. But this was what I wanted, you see. It didn't matter. No, this was what I thought I wanted. As soon as we reached the house, I jumped down out of the carriage and walked, a zombie, to the brick stairs where my brother had fallen. The house had been unoccupied for months now, the overseer having his own cottage, and the Louisiana heat and damp were already picking apart the steps. Every crevice was sprouting grass and even small wildflowers. I remember feeling the moisture, which in the night was cool, as I sat down on the lower steps and even rested my head against the brick and felt the little wax-stemmed wildflowers with my hands. I pulled a clump of them out of the easy dirt in one hand. I want to die. Kill me. Kill me, I said to the vampire. Now I am guilty of murder. I can't live. He sneered with the impatience of people listening to the obvious lies of others. And then in a flash he had fastened on me just as he had on my man. I thrashed against him wildly. I dug my boot into his chest and kicked him as fiercely as I could, his teeth stinging my throat, the fever pounding in my temples. And with a movement of his entire body, much too fast for me to see, he was suddenly standing disdainfully at the foot of the steps. I thought you wanted to die, Louis, he said. The boy made a soft, abrupt sound when the vampire said his name, which the vampire acknowledged with the quick statement, "Yes, that is my name," and went on. Well, I lay there, helpless in the face of my own cowardice and fatuousness again, he said. Perhaps so directly confronted with it, I might, in time, have gained the courage to truly take my life, not to whine and beg for others to take it. I saw myself turning on a knife then, languishing in a day-to-day suffering which I found as necessary as penance from the confessional, truly hoping death would find me unawares and render me fit for eternal pardon. And also I saw myself as if in a vision, standing at the head of the stairs, just where my brother had stood, and then hurtling my body down on the bricks. But there was no time for courage. Or shall I say, there was no time in Lestat's plan for anything but his plan. Now listen to me, Louis, he said, and he lay down beside me now on the steps, his movement so graceful and so personal that at once it made me think of a lover. I recoiled. But he put his right arm around me and pulled me close to his chest. Never had I been this close to him before. And in the dim light I could see the magnificent radiance of his eye and the unnatural mask of his skin. As I tried to move, he pressed his right fingers against my lips and said, "Be still. I'm going to drain you now to the very threshold of death, and I want you to be quiet. So quiet that you can almost hear the flow of blood through your veins. So quiet that you can hear the flow of that same blood through mine. It is your consciousness, your will, which must keep you alive." I wanted to struggle, but he pressed so hard with his fingers that he held my entire prone body in check. And as soon as I stopped my abortive attempt at rebellion, he sank his teeth into my neck. The boy's eyes grew huge. He had drawn farther and farther back in his chair as the vampire spoke, and now his face was tense, his eyes narrow, as if he were preparing to weather a blow. "Have you ever lost a great amount of blood?" asked the vampire. "Do you know the feeling?" The boy's lips shaped the word "no," but no sound came up. He cleared his throat. "No," he said. Candles burned in the upstairs parlor, where he had planned the death of the overseer. An oil lantern swayed in the breeze on the gallery. All of this light coalesced and began to shimmer, as though a golden presence, softly entangled with the railings, curling and contracting like smoke. "Listen. Keep your eyes wide," Lestat whispered to me, his lips moving against my neck. I remember that the movement of his lips raised the hair all over my body, sent a shock of sensation through my body that was not unlike the pleasure of passion. He mused. His right finger slightly curled beneath his chin, the first finger appearing to lightly stroke it. The result was that within minutes I was weak to paralysis. Panic-stricken, I discovered I could not even will myself to speak. Lestat still held me, of course, and his arm was like the weight of an iron bar. I felt his teeth withdraw with such a keenness that the 2 puncture wounds seemed enormous, lined with pain. And now he bent over my helpless head and, taking his right hand off me, bit his own wrist. The blood flowed down upon my shirt and coat, and he watched it with a narrow, gleaming eye. It seemed an eternity that he watched it, and that shimmer of light now hung behind his head like the backdrop of an apparition. I think that I knew what he meant to do, even before he did it, and I was waiting in my helplessness as if I'd been waiting for years. He pressed his bleeding wrist to my mouth, said firmly, a little impatiently, "Louis, drink." And I did. "Steady, Louis, and hurry," he whispered to me a number of times. I drank, sucking the blood out of the holes, experiencing for the first time since infancy the special pleasure of sucking nourishment, the body focused with the mind upon one vital source. Then something happened. The vampire sat back, a slight frown on his face. "How pathetic it is to describe these things which can't truly be described," he said, his voice low, almost to a whisper. The boy sat as if frozen. "I saw nothing but that light then, as I drew blood. And then this next thing was sound. A dull roar at first, and then a pounding like the pounding of a drum, growing louder and louder, as if some enormous creature were coming up on one, slowly through a dark and alien forest, pounding as he came, a huge drum. And then there came the pounding of another drum, as if another giant were coming, yards behind him. And each giant, intent on his own drum, gave no notice to the rhythm of the other. The sound grew louder and louder until it seemed to fill not just my hearing, but all my senses, to be throbbing in my lips and fingers, in the flesh of my temples, in my veins. Above all, in my veins. Drum, and then the other drum. And then Lestat pulled his wrist free suddenly, and I opened my eyes and checked myself in a moment of reaching for his wrist, grabbing it, forcing it back to my mouth at all costs. I checked myself because I realized that the drum was my heart, and the second drum had been his. The vampire sighed. Do you understand? The boy began to speak, and then he shook his head. No, I mean, I do, he said. I mean, of course, said the vampire, looking away. Wait, said the boy in a welter of excitement. The tape is almost gone. I have to turn it over. The vampire watched patiently as he changed it. What happened then? The boy asked. His face was moist, and he wiped it hurriedly with his handkerchief. I saw as a vampire, said the vampire, his voice now slightly detached. It seemed almost distracted. Then he drew himself up. Lestat was standing again at the foot of the stairs, and I saw him as I could not possibly have seen him before. He had seemed white to me before, starkly white, so that in the night he was almost luminous. And now I saw him filled with his own life and own blood. He was radiant, not luminous. And then I saw that not only Lestat had changed, but all things had changed. It was as if I had only just been able to see colors and shapes for the first time. I was so enthralled with the buttons on Lestat's black coat that I looked at nothing else for a long time. Then Lestat began to laugh, and I heard his laughter as I had never heard anything before. His heart I still heard like the beating of a drum, and now came this metallic laughter. It was confusing, each sound running into the next sound, like the mingling reverberations of bells, until I learned to separate the sounds. And then they overlapped, each soft but distinct, increasing but discreet, peals of laughter. The vampire smiled with delight. Peals of bells. Stop looking at my buttons, Lestat said. Go out there into the trees. Rid yourself of all the human waste in your body, and don't fall so madly in love with the night that you lose your way. That, of course, was a wise command. When I saw the moon on the flagstones, I became so enamored with it that I must have spent an hour there. I passed my brother's oratory without so much as a thought of him. And standing among the cottonwood and oaks, I heard the night as if it were a chorus of whispering women, all beckoning me to their breasts. As for my body, it was not yet totally converted. And as soon as I became the least accustomed to the sounds and sights, it began to ache. All my human fluids were being forced out of me. I was dying as a human, yet completely alive as a vampire. And with my awakened senses, I had to preside over the death of my body with a certain discomfort, and then, finally, fear. I ran back up the steps to the parlor, where Lestat was already at work on the plantation papers, going over the expenses and profits for the last year. "You're a rich man," he said to me when I came in. "Something's happening to me," I shouted. You're dying, that's all. Don't be a fool. Don't you have any oil lamps? All this money and you can't afford whale oil except for that lantern? Bring me that lantern. Dying! I shouted, dying! It happens to everyone, he persisted, refusing to help me. As I look back on this, I still despise him for it. Not because I was afraid, but because he might have drawn my attention to these changes with reverence. He might have calmed me and told me I might watch my death with the same fascination with which I had watched and felt the night, but he didn't. Lestat was never the vampire I am. Not at all. The vampire did not say this boastfully. He said it as if he would truly have had it otherwise. Alors, he sighed. I was dying fast, which meant that my capacity for fear was diminishing as rapidly. I simply regret I was not more attentive to the process. Lestat was being a perfect idiot. Oh, for the love of hell, he began shouting. Do you realize I've made no provision for you? What a fool I am. I was tempted to say, yes, you are, but I didn't. You'll have to bed down with me this morning. I haven't prepared you a coffin. The vampire laughed. The coffin struck such a chord of terror in me, I think it absorbed all the capacity for terror I had left. Then came only my mild alarm at having to share a coffin with Lestat. He was in my father's bedroom, meantime, telling the old man goodbye, that he would return in the morning. But where do you go? Why must you live by such a schedule? The old man demanded, and Lestat became impatient. Before this he'd been gracious to the old man, almost to the point of sickening one. But now he became a bully. I take care of you, don't I? I've put a better roof over your head than you ever put over mine. If I want to sleep all day and drink all night, I'll do it, damn you. The old man started to whine. Only my peculiar state of emotions and most unusual feeling of exhaustion kept me from disapproving. I was watching the scene through the open door, enthralled with the colors of the counterpane and the positive riot of color in the old man's face. His blue veins pulsed beneath his pink and grayish flesh. I found even the yellow of his teeth appealing to me, and became almost hypnotized by the quivering of his lip. Such a son, he said, never suspecting, of course, the true nature of his son. All right, then, go. I know you keep a woman somewhere. You go to see her as soon as her husband leaves in the morning. Give me my rosary. What's happened to my rosary? Lestat said something blasphemous and gave him the rosary. But, the boy started. Yes, said the vampire. I'm afraid I don't allow you to ask enough questions. I was going to ask, rosaries have crosses on them, don't they? Oh, the rumor about crosses, the vampire laughed. You refer to our being afraid of crosses? Unable to look on them, I thought, said the boy. Nonsense, my friend, sheer nonsense. I can look on anything I like, and I rather like looking on crucifixes in particular. And what about the rumor about keyholes, that you can become steam and go through them? I wish I could, laughed the vampire. How positively delightful. I should like to pass through all manner of different keyholes and feel the tickle of their peculiar shapes. No, he shook his head, that is, how would you say today? Bullshit. The boy laughed, despite himself. Then his face grew serious. You mustn't be so shy with me, the vampire said. What is it? The story about stakes through the heart. The same, said the vampire. Bullshit, he said, carefully articulating both syllables so that the boy smiled. No magical power whatsoever. Why don't you smoke one of your cigarettes? I see you have them in your shirt pocket. Oh, thank you, the boy said, as if it were a marvelous suggestion. But once he had the cigarette to his lips, his hands were trembling so badly that he mangled the first fragile bookmatch. Allow me, said the vampire. And taking the book, he quickly put a lighted match to the boy's cigarette. The boy inhaled, his eyes on the vampire's fingers. Now the vampire withdrew across the table with a soft rustling of garments. "There's an ashtray on the basin," he said, and the boy moved nervously to get it. He stared at the few butts in it for a moment, and then seeing the small wastebasket beneath, he emptied the ashtray and quickly set it on the table. His fingers left damp marks on the cigarette when he put it down. "Is this your room?" he asked. "No," answered the vampire, "just a room." "What happened then?" the boy asked. The vampire appeared to be watching the smoke gather beneath the overhead bulb. "Ah, we went back to New Orleans post-haste," he said. Lestat had his coffin in a miserable room near the ramparts. "And did you get into the coffin?" "I had no choice. I begged Lestat to let me stay in the closet, but he laughed, astonished. 'Don't you know what you are?' he asked. 'But is it magical? Must it have this shape?' I pleaded, only to hear him laugh again. I couldn't bear the idea. But as we argued, I realized I had no real fear. It was a strange realization. All my life I'd feared closed places. Born and bred in French houses with lofty ceilings and floor-length windows, I had a dread of being enclosed. I felt uncomfortable even in the confessional in church. It was a normal enough fear. And now I realized, as I protested to Lestat, I did not actually feel this anymore. I was simply remembering it, hanging on to it from habit, from a deficiency of ability to recognize my present and exhilarating freedom. "You're carrying on badly," Lestat said finally. "And it's almost dawn. I should let you die. You will die, you know. The sun will destroy the blood I've given you, in every tissue, every vein. But you shouldn't be feeling this fear at all. I think you're like a man who loses an arm or a leg and keeps insisting that he can feel pain where the arm or leg used to be." Well, that was positively the most intelligent and useful thing Lestat ever said in my presence. And it brought me around at once. "Now I'm getting into the coffin," he finally said to me in his most disdainful tone, "and you will get in on top of me if you know what's good for you." And I did. I lay face down on him, utterly confused by my absence of dread and filled with a distaste for being so close to him, handsome and intriguing though he was. And he shut the lid. Then I asked him if I was completely dead. My body was tingling and itching all over. "No, you're not dead," he said. "When you are, you'll only hear and see it changing and feel nothing. You should be dead by tonight. Go to sleep." Was he right? Were you dead when you woke up? Yes. Changed, I should say. As obviously I am alive. My body was dead. It was some time before it became absolutely cleansed of the fluids and matter it no longer needed, but it was dead. And with the realization of it came another stage in my divorce from human emotions. The first thing which became apparent to me, even while Lestat and I were loading the coffin into a hearse and stealing another coffin from a mortuary, was that I did not like Lestat at all. I was far from being his equal yet, but I was infinitely closer to him than I had been before the death of my body. I can't really make this clear to you for the obvious reason that you are now as I was before my body died. You cannot understand. But before I died, Lestat was absolutely the most overwhelming experience I'd ever had. Your cigarette has become one long cylindrical ash. Oh! The boy quickly ground the filter into the glass. "You mean that when the gap was closed between you, he lost his spell?" he asked, his eyes quickly fixed on the vampire, his hands now producing a cigarette and match much more easily than before. "Yes," That's correct, said the vampire with obvious pleasure. The trip back to Pointe du Lac was thrilling, and the constant chatter of Lestat was positively the most boring and disheartening thing I experienced. Of course, as I said, I was far from being his equal. I had my dead limbs to contend with, to use his comparison. And I learned that on that very night when I had to make my first kill.
This ends Disc 1. Interview with the Vampire, Disc 2.
The vampire reached across the table now and gently brushed an ash from the boy's lapel, and the boy stared at his withdrawing hand in alarm. "Excuse me," said the vampire. "I didn't mean to frighten you." "Excuse me," said the boy. "I just got the impression suddenly that your arm was abnormally long. You reached so far without moving." "No," said the vampire, resting his hands again on his crossed knees. "I moved forward much too fast for you to see. It was an illusion." "You moved forward? But you didn't. You were sitting just as you are now, with your back against the chair." "No," repeated the vampire firmly. "I moved forward, as I told you. Here, I'll do it again." And he did it again. And the boy stared with the same mixture of confusion and fear. "You still didn't see it," said the vampire. "But you see, if you look at my outstretched arm now, it's really not remarkably long at all." And he raised his arm, first finger pointing heavenward, as if he were an angel about to give the word of the Lord. "You have experienced a fundamental difference between the way you see and I see. My gesture appeared slow and somewhat languid to me, and the sound of my finger brushing your coat was quite audible. Well, I didn't mean to frighten you, I confess. But perhaps you can see from this that my return to Pointe du Lac was a feast of new experiences, the mere swaying of a tree branch in the wind of delight." "Yes," said the boy, but he was still visibly shaken. The vampire eyed him for a moment, and then he said, "I was telling you about your first kill," said the boy. "Yes. I should say first, however, that the plantation was in a state of pandemonium. The overseer's body had been found, and no one could explain the blind old man's presence. And no one had been able to find me in New Orleans. My sister had contacted the police, and several of them were at Pointe du Lac when I arrived. It was already quite dark, naturally, and Lestat quickly explained to me that I must not let the police see me in even minimal light, especially not with my body in its present remarkable state. So I talked to them in the Avenue of Oaks before the plantation house, ignoring their requests that we go inside. I explained I'd been to Pointe du Lac the night before, and the blind old man was my guest. As for the overseer, he had not been here, but had gone to New Orleans on business. After that was settled, during which my new detachment served me admirably, I had the problem of the plantation itself. My slaves were in a state of complete confusion, and no work had been done all day. We had a large plant then for the making of indigo dye. The overseer's management had been most important. But I had several extremely intelligent slaves who might have done his job just as well a long time before if I had recognized their intelligence and not feared their African appearance and manner. I studied them clearly now and gave the management of things over to them. To the best, I gave the overseer's house on a promise. 2 of the young women were brought back into the house from the fields to care for Lestat's father, and I told them I wanted as much privacy as possible, and they would all of them be rewarded not only for service, but for leaving me and Lestat absolutely alone. I did not realize at the time that these slaves would be the first and possibly the only ones to ever suspect that Lestat and I are not ordinary creatures. I failed to realize that their experience with the supernatural was far greater than that of white men. In my own inexperience, I still thought of them as childlike savages, barely domesticated by slavery. I made a bad mistake. But let me keep to my story. I was going to tell you about my first kill. Lestat bungled it with his characteristic lack of common sense. Bungled it? Asked the boy. I should never have started with human beings. But this was something I had to learn by myself. Lestat had us plunge headlong into the swamps right after the police and the slaves were settled. It was very late, and the slave cabins were completely dark. We soon lost sight of the lights of Pointe du Lac altogether, and I became very agitated. It was the same thing again. Remembered fears, confusion. Lestat, had he any native intelligence, might have explained things to me patiently and gently. That I had no need to fear the swamps, that to snakes and insects I was utterly invulnerable, and that I must concentrate on my new ability to see in total darkness. Instead, he harassed me with He was concerned only with our victims, with finishing my initiation and getting on with it. And when we finally came upon our victims, he rushed me into action. They were a small camp of runaway slaves. Lestat had visited them before and picked off perhaps a fourth of their number by watching from the dark for one of them to leave the fire, or by taking them in their sleep. They knew absolutely nothing of Lestat's presence. We had to watch for well over an hour before one of the men, they were all men, finally left the clearing and came just a few paces into the trees. He unhooked his pants now and attended to an ordinary physical necessity. And as he turned to go, Lestat shook me and said, "Take him." The vampire smiled at the boy's wide eyes. "I think I was about as horror-struck as you would be," he said. "But I didn't know then that I might kill animals instead of humans." I said quickly I could not possibly take him. And the slave heard me speak. He turned, his back to the distant fire, and peered into the dark. Then quickly and silently he drew a long knife out of his belt. He was naked except for the pants and the belt, a tall, strong-armed, sleek young man. He said something in the French patois, and then he stepped forward. I realized that though I saw him clearly in the dark, he could not see us. Lestat stepped in back of him with a swiftness that baffled me and got a hold around his neck while he pinned his left arm. The slave cried out and tried to throw Lestat off. He sank his teeth now, and the slave froze as if from snakebite. He sank to his knees, and Lestat fed fast as the other slaves came running. "You sicken me," he said when he got back to me. It was as if we were black insects, utterly camouflaged in the night, watching the slaves move, oblivious to us, discover the wounded man, drag him back, fan out in the foliage, searching for the attacker. "Come on, we have to get another one before they all return to camp," he said. And quickly we set off after one man who was separated from the others. I was still terribly agitated, convinced I couldn't bring myself to attack, and feeling no urge to do so. There were many things, as I mentioned, which Lestat might have said and done. He might have made the experience rich in so many ways, but he did not. "What could he have done?" the boy asked. "What do you mean?" "Killing is no ordinary act," said the vampire. "One doesn't simply glut oneself on blood." He shook his head. "It is the experience of another's life, for certain, and often the experience of the loss of that life through the blood slope. It is again and again the experience of the loss of my own life, which I experienced when I sucked the blood from Lestat's wrist and felt his heart pound with my heart. Again and again, a celebration of that experience with someone who held a different view. I don't think Lestat ever appreciated that, though how he could not, I don't know. Let me say he appreciated something, but very little, I think, of what there is to know. In any event, he took no pains to remind me now of what I'd felt when I clamped onto his wrist for life itself and wouldn't let it go, or to pick and choose a place for me where I might experience my first kill with some measure of quiet and dignity. He rushed headlong through the encounter, as if it was something to put behind us as quickly as possible, like so many yards of the road. Once he had caught the slave, he gagged him and held him, baring his neck. "Do it," he said. "You can't turn back now." Overcome with revulsion and weak with frustration, I obeyed. I knelt beside the bent, struggling man, and clamping both my hands on his shoulders, I went into his neck. My teeth had only just begun to change, and I had to tear his flesh, not puncture it. But once the wound was made, the blood flowed. And once that happened, once I was locked onto it, drinking, all else vanished. Lestat and the swamp and the noise of the distant camp meant nothing. Lestat might have been an insect, buzzing, lighting, then vanishing in significance. The sucking mesmerized me. The warm struggling of the man was soothing to the tension of my hands. And there came the beating of the drum again, which was the drum beat of his heart. Only this time it beat in perfect rhythm with the drum beat of my own heart, the two resounding in every fiber of my being, until the beat began to grow slower and slower, so that each was a soft rumble that threatened to go on without end. I was drowsy, falling into weightlessness, and then Lestat pulled me back. "He's dead, you idiot," he said with his characteristic charm and tact. "You don't drink after they're dead, understand that." I was in a frenzy for a moment, not myself, insisting to him that the man's heart still beat, and I was in an agony to clamp onto him again. I ran my hands over his chest, then grabbed at his wrists. I would have cut into his wrist if Lestat hadn't pulled me to my feet and slapped my face. This slap was astonishing. It was not painful in the ordinary way. It was a sensational shock of another sort, a rapping of the senses, so that I spun in confusion and found myself helpless and staring, my back against a cypress, the night pulsing with insects in my ears. "You'll die if you do that," Lestat was saying. "He'll suck you right down into death with him if you cling to him in death. Now you've drunk too much. Besides, you'll be ill." His voice grated on me. I had the urge to throw myself on him suddenly, but I was feeling just what he'd said. There was a grinding pain in my stomach, as if some whirlpool there were sucking my insides into itself. It was the blood passing too rapidly into my own blood, but I didn't know it. Lestat moved through the night now like a cat, and I followed him, my head throbbing, this pain in my stomach no better when we reached the house of Pontelac. As we sat at the table in the parlor, Lestat dealing a game of solitaire on the polished wood, I sat there staring at him with contempt. He was mumbling nonsense. I would get used to killing, he said. It would be nothing. I must not allow myself to be shaken. I was reacting too much as if the mortal coil had not been shaken off. I would become accustomed to things all too quickly. "Do you think so?" I asked him finally. I really had no interest in his answer. I understood now the difference between us. For me, the experience of killing had been cataclysmic. So had that of sucking Lestat's wrist. These experiences so overwhelmed and so changed my view of everything around me, from the picture of my brother on the parlor wall to the sight of a single star on the topmost pane of the French window, that I could not imagine another vampire taking them for granted. I was altered, permanently. I knew it. And what I felt most profoundly for everything, even the sound of the playing cards being laid down one by one upon the shining rows of the solitaire, was respect. Lestat felt the opposite. Or he felt nothing. He was the sow's ear out of which nothing fine could be made. As boring as a mortal, as trivial and unhappy as a mortal. He chattered over the game, belittling my experience, utterly locked against the possibility of any experience of his own. By morning I realized that I was his complete superior, and I had been sadly cheated in having him for a teacher. He must guide me through the necessary lessons, if there were any more real lessons, and I must tolerate in him a frame of mind which was blasphemous to life itself. I felt cold towards him. I had no contempt in superiority, only a hunger for new experience, for that which was beautiful and as devastating as my king. And I saw that if I were to maximize every experience available to me, I must exert my own powers over my learning. Lestat was of no use. It was well past midnight when I finally rose out of the chair and went out on the gallery. The moon was large over the cypresses, and the candlelight poured from the open doors. The thick-plastered pillars and walls of the house had been freshly whitewashed, the floorboards freshly swept, and a summer rain had left the night clean and sparkling with drops of water. I leaned against the end pillar of the gallery, my head touching the soft tendrils of a jasmine which grew there in constant battle with the wisteria, and I thought of what lay before me throughout the world, throughout time, and resolved to go about it delicately and reverently, learning that from each thing which would take me best to another. What this meant I wasn't sure myself. Do you understand me when I say I did not wish to rush headlong into experience? That what I'd felt as a vampire was far too powerful to be wasted? Yes, said the boy eagerly. It sounds as if it was like being in love. The vampire's eyes gleamed. That's correct. It is like love. He smiled. And I tell you my frame of mind that night, so you can know there are profound differences between vampires, and how I came to take a different approach from Lestat. You must understand I did not snub him because he did not appreciate his experience. I simply could not understand how such feelings could be wasted. But then Lestat did something which was to show me a way to go about my learning. He had more than a casual appreciation of the wealth at Pointe-Blanc. He'd been much pleased by the beauty of the china used for his father's supper, and he liked the feel of the velvet drapes, and he traced the patterns of the carpets with his toe. And now he took from one of the china closets a crystal glass and said, I do miss glasses. Only he said this with an impish delight that caused me to study him with a hard eye. I disliked him intensely. I want to show you a little trick, he said. That is, if you like glasses. And after setting it on the card table, he came out on the gallery where I stood, and changed his manner again into that of a stalking animal, eyes piercing the dark beyond the lights of the house, peering down under the arching branches of the oaks. In an instant he had vaulted the railing and dropped softly on the dirt below, and then lunged into the blackness to catch something in both his hands. When he stood before me with it, I gasped to see it was a rat. Don't be such a damned idiot, he said. Haven't you ever seen a rat? It was a huge, struggling field rat with a long tail. He held its neck so it couldn't bite. "Rats can be quite nice," he said. And he took the rat to the wine glass, slashed its throat, and filled the glass rapidly with blood. The rat then went hurtling over the gallery railing. Lestat held the wine glass to the candle triumphantly. "You may well have to live off rats from time to time, so wipe that expression off your face," he said. "Rats, chicken, cattle. Traveling by ship, you damn well better live off rats if you don't wish to cause such a panic on board that they search your coffin. You damn well better keep the ship clean of rats." And then he sipped the blood as delicately as if it were burgundy. He made a slight face. "It gets cold so fast." "Do you mean, then, we can live from animals?" I asked. "Yes." He drank it all down and then casually threw the glass at the fireplace. I stared at the fragments. "You don't mind, do you?" He gestured to the broken glass with a sarcastic smile. "I surely hope you don't, because there's nothing much you can do about it if you do mind." "I can throw you and your father out of Pointe du Lac if I mind," I said. I believe this was my first show of temper. "Why would you do that?" he asked with mock alarm. "You don't know everything yet, do you?" He was laughing then and walking slowly about the room. He ran his fingers over the satin finish of the spinet. "Do you play?" he asked. I said something like, "Don't touch it," and he laughed at me. "I'll touch it if I like," he said. "You don't know, for example, all the ways you can die. And dying now would be such a calamity, wouldn't it?" "There must be someone else in the world to teach me these things," I said. "Certainly you're not the only vampire. And your father, he's perhaps 70. You couldn't have been a vampire long, so someone must have instructed you. And do you think you can find other vampires by yourself? They might see you coming, my friend, but you won't see them. No, I don't think you have much choice about things at this point, friend. I'm your teacher, and you need me, and there isn't much you can do about it either way. And we both have people to provide for. My father needs a doctor. And then there is the matter of your mother and sister. Don't get any mortal notions about telling them you are a vampire. Just provide for them and for my father. Which means that tomorrow night you had better kill fast and then attend to the business of your plantation. Now to bed. We both sleep in the same room. It makes for far less risk." "No, you secure the bedroom for yourself," I said. "I've no intention of staying in the same room with you." He became furious. "Don't do anything stupid, Louis, I warn you. There's nothing you can do to defend yourself once the sun rises. Nothing. Separate rooms mean separate security, double precautions, and double chance of notice." He then said a score of things to frighten me into complying. But he might as well have been talking to the walls. I watched him intently, but I didn't listen to him. He appeared frail and stupid to me. A man made of dried twigs with a thin, carping voice. "I can sleep alone," I said, and gently put my hand around the candle flames one by one. "It's almost morning," he insisted. "So lock yourself in," I said, embracing my coffin, hoisting it and carrying it down the brick stairs. I could hear the locks snapping on the French doors above, the swoosh of the drapes. The sky was pale, but still sprinkled with stars, and another light rain blew now on the breeze from the river, speckling the flagstones. I opened the door of my brother's oratory, shoving back the roses and thorns which had almost sealed it, and set the coffin on the stone floor before the prie-dieu. I could almost make out the images of the saints on the walls. "Paul," I said softly, addressing my brother, "for the first time in my life I feel nothing for you, nothing for your death. And for the first time I feel everything for you. Feel the sorrow of your loss as if I never before knew feeling. You see," the vampire turned toward the boy, "for the first time now, I was fully and completely a vampire. I shut the wood blinds flat upon the small barred windows and bolted the door. Then I climbed into the satin-lined coffin, barely able to see the gleam of cloth in the darkness, and locked myself in. That is how I became a vampire. And there you were, said the boy after a pause, with another vampire you hated. But I had to stay with him, answered the vampire. As I've told you, he had me at a great disadvantage. He hinted there was much I didn't know and must know, and that he alone could tell me. But in fact, the main part of what he did teach me was practical, and not so difficult to figure out for oneself. How we might travel, for instance, by ship, having our coffins transported for us as though they contained the remains of loved ones being sent here or there for burial. How no one would dare to open such a coffin, and we might rise from it at night to clean the ship of rats, things of this nature. And then there were the shops and businessmen he knew who admitted us well after hours to outfit us in the finest Paris fashions, and those agents willing to transact financial matters in restaurants and cabarets. And in all of these mundane matters, Lestat was an adequate teacher. What manner of man he'd been in life, I couldn't tell, and didn't care. But he was, for all appearances, of the same class now as myself, which meant little to me, except that it made our lives run a little more smoothly than they might have otherwise. He had impeccable taste, though my library to him was a pile of dust, and he seemed more than once to be infuriated by the sight of my reading a book or writing some observations in a journal. That mortal nonsense, he would say to me, while at the same time spending so much of my money to splendidly furnish Pointe du Lac that even I, who cared nothing for the money, was forced to wince. And in entertaining visitors at Pointe du Lac, those hapless travelers who came up the river road by horseback or carriage, begging accommodations for the night, sporting letters of introduction from other planters or officials in New Orleans, to these he was so gentle and polite that it made things far easier for me, who found myself hopelessly locked, jarred over and over by his viciousness. But he didn't harm these men, asked the boy. Oh yes, often he did. But I'll tell you a little secret, if I may, which applies not only to vampires, but to generals, soldiers, and kings. Most of us would much rather see somebody die than be the object of rudeness under our roofs. Strange, yes, but very true, I assure you. That Lestat hunted for mortals every night, I knew. But had he been savage and ugly to my family, my guests, and my slaves, I couldn't have endured it. He was not. He seemed particularly to delight in the visitors. But he said we must spare no expense where our families were concerned. And he seemed to me to push luxury upon his father to an almost ludicrous point. The old blind man must be told constantly how fine and expensive were his bed jackets and robes, and what imported draperies had just been fixed to his bed, and what French and Spanish wines we had in the cellar, and how much the plantation yielded, even in bad years, when the coast talked of abandoning the indigo production altogether and going into sugar. But then at other times he would bully the old man, as I mentioned. He would erupt into such rage that the old man whimpered like a child. "Don't I take care of you in baronial splendor?" Lestat would shout at him. "Don't I provide for your every want? Stop whining to me about going to church or to old friends. Such nonsense. Your old friends are dead. Why don't you die and leave me and my bankroll in peace?" The old man would cry softly that these things meant so little to him in old age. He would have been content on his little farm forever. I wanted often to ask him later, where was this farm? From where did you come to Louisiana? To get some clue to that place where Lestat might have known another vampire. But I didn't dare to bring these things up, lest the old man start crying and Lestat become enraged. But these fits were no more frequent than periods of near obsequious kindness, when Lestat would bring his father's supper on a tray and feed him patiently, while talking the weather and the New Orleans news and the activities. But how it came about, I could not quite guess. And from this whole matter I achieved a somewhat consistent detachment. Existence, as I've said, was possible. There was always the promise behind his mocking smile that he knew great things, or terrible things, had commerce with levels of darkness I could not possibly guess at. And all the time he belittled me and attacked me for my love of the senses, my reluctance to kill, and the near swoon which killing could produce in me. He laughed uproariously when I discovered that I could see myself in a mirror and that crosses had no effect upon me, and would taunt me with sealed lips when I asked about God or the devil. "I'd like to meet the devil some night," he said once with a malignant smile. "I'd chase him from here to the wilds of the Pacific. I am the devil." When I was aghast at this, he went into peals of laughter. But what happened was simply that in my distaste for him, I came to ignore and suspect him, and yet to study him with a detached fascination. Sometimes I'd find myself staring at his wrist, from which I'd drawn my vampire life, and I would fall into such a stillness that my mind seemed to leave my body, or rather my body to become my mind. And then he would see me and stare at me with a stubborn ignorance of what I felt and longed to know, and reaching over, shake me roughly out of it. I bore this with an overt detachment unknown to me in mortal life, and came to understand this as a part of vampire nature. That I might sit at home at Pointe du Lac and think for hours of my brother's mortal life, and see it short and rounded in unfathomable darkness, understanding now the vain and senseless wasting passion with which I'd mourned his loss, and turned on other mortals like a maddened animal. All that confusion was then like dancers frenzied in a fog. And now in this strange vampire nature, I felt a profound sadness. But I did not brood over this. Let me not give you that impression, for brooding would have been to me the most terrible waste. But rather I looked around me at all the mortals that I knew, and saw all life as precious, condemning all fruitless guilt and passion that would let it slip through the fingers like sand. It was only now, as a vampire, that I did come to know my sister, forbidding her the plantation for the city life which she so needed in order to know her own time of life and her own beauty, and come to marry, not brood for our lost brother, or my going away, or become a nursemaid for our mother. And I provided for them all they might need or want, finding even the most trivial request worth my immediate attention. My sister laughed at the transformation in me when we would meet at night, and I would take her from our flat out the narrow wooden streets to walk along the tree-lined levee in the moonlight, savoring the orange blossoms and the caressing warmth, talking for hours of her most secret thoughts and dreams, those little fantasies she dared to tell no one, and would even whisper to me when we sat in the dim-lit parlor entirely alone. And I would see her sweet and palpable before me, a shimmering, precious creature soon to grow old, soon to die, soon to lose these moments that in their intangibility promise to us wrongly, an immortality, as if it were our very birthright, which we could not come to grasp the meaning of until this time of middle life, when we looked on only as many years ahead as already lay behind us. When every moment must be first known and then savored. It was detachment that made this possible. A sublime loneliness with which Lestat and I moved through the world of mortal men, and all material troubles passed from us. I should tell you the practical nature of it.
8.
Lestat had always known how to steal from victims chosen for sumptuous dress and other promising signs of extravagance. But the great problems of shelter and secrecy had been for him a terrible struggle.
8.
I suspected that beneath his gentleman's veneer he was painfully ignorant of the most simple financial matters. But I was not. And so he could acquire cash at any moment, and I could invest it. If he were not picking the pocket of a dead man in an alley, he was at the greatest gambling table